All right, I would like to call the meeting to order. Jake, you have the roll call.
Yes,
Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the April 6th meeting?
and we're not included in the packet from our end, so we'll have to have those at the next meeting.
Oh, okay, we'll wait for the next meeting for those. There are no appearances that I'm aware of. Have you been notified of them?
They're not doing
Appearances, okay. No unfinished business, under new business, item 6A, discussion of survey results and comments received through May 10th. So Dan, did you say Dan Schmidt is going to lead this or?
Oh, for this survey, Dan, do you have the surveys? At hand, I'm not online.
Not sure if he heard you. Dan Schmidt, do you have the survey results?
Can you guys hear us?
Yep, sorry, looking for my.
Are we here?
Just getting that stuff pulled up here. Overall, I checked this morning, we had about 817 responses overall to the online survey. And I'll just
We're getting there.
need to.
Put the link in the new city newsletter that goes out on either Wednesday or Thursday, so. Hopefully that helps.
I didn't really see anybody use the code on Friday. Anybody over at the board?
Somebody told me they had tried it, but I don't know if she actually spent the time completing the survey.
Matching. Oh, wow. I said my dog cheating.
Now you
Looking good,
found my
guys.
card.
Well, do we need to dig into the survey results much or?
Yeah, Dan, are you gonna,
I don't think we need to dig into them.
Dan Williams, what were you planning on doing with the survey results?
We were going to show the graphic part, but in the package, did you send that? Yeah.
Yeah.
you sent it
With all the
out. There was,
comments.
Emily started going through the comments
Mhm.
and she was at 550s where she stopped on the comments. So she hasn't got the last 300 in yet.
Okay.
But there's consistency in the fact that for the main components that you would be most interested in the house versus the new building and the smaller shelter. The last that I saw, which was 700 and some, there's a valuation that's put on the like and dislike or keep and not keep, whatever, how we phrase it. And the valuation is points at the end. So there's percentages and then the points, and it was 1.91 for the house, 1.90 for the shelter, and 2.1 for the new event center. Barry's got it up. So it's real close as far as percentage points. But when you look at the three columns that are down in the text part of it, there's definitely a high end on the house and a low end.
Can you enlarge that a little bit, Dan?
Yep, I will.
Is that in our packet?
Yeah, it's in the
Yeah.
packet
It's
too.
in what page? Five.
So see, it's still pretty consistent, those numbers.
Part of the survey summary. Survey summaries at the end.
Page 40. So
It's right at the beginning of the survey summaries. It's past all those pictures of the questions.
So you can see over here on the far right is the aggregate score, 1.92. So the house has gone up just 1.01 and the shelter's gone down a little bit. But the event center has gone up 0.09, so it's starting to go up a little bit. But the other interesting thing is you got 36 for number one versus 44 here. And it's kind of the same as 43 here versus 24 for not, but that the pavilion's kind of in the middle.
So what does one represent?
One is
Your
like
prioritization.
basically like the best versus three is. Doesn't.
Threes
matter.
doesn't really care.
These
Yeah.
folks are-
So
So it's not a negative, it's a ranking.
Yeah.
Just
And two is two, I don't care either way, or don't care as much,
Yeah.
I think.
What was, the question was most desirable to least desirable in order.
Okay.
So you had to rank them. Got it, okay.
Yeah.
So it means most
So
people
they
put
didn't
that.
tell us.
That's.
But that's the thing about the comments. So what Emily was finding in the comments. On the house comment, there were people that said, well, I'd really like to see the house saved. But I understand it's in really bad shape and it has to go, I'm good with that basically. There was, I wouldn't say that was the majority, but there were a lot of people that had that sentiment.
And this is missing 300 responses.
This actually is the 700, so we're about 100 short.
Okay, so we're missing 100 or something.
One thing I just wanted to mention about the comments, you know, there's two sets of comments for two different questions. So I think a lot of what's in the second one is just a repeat of what
Yeah,
was in the
there is
first.
some repeat.
So makes it look like either there's a lot more for keeping the house or a lot more for not, but it's really, I think we have to keep in mind it's like double, yeah, in a lot of cases.
And that's what Emily's doing with, as she goes through this, then she's going to put together a list of, she's calling them themes, but it would be most heard or most, that would catch some of that
Okay.
discussion.
Okay, so Dan Schmidt,
Yep.
did you have more you were gonna talk about, or?
Oh, the
yeah,
parking
we
lot.
Oh, yeah, I'd say we can pop through those quick here. I think that's, I mean, the high level piece, particularly on the houses, that it's much more evenly split than we would thought. The parking layout is kind of the opposite, is strongly in favor of a more pulled away parking towards Monona Drive, as in concept C. So I think as we look for developing the final master plan, the sizing of that will be adjusted to match the proposed program, but I think that's easily seen as kind of the preferred route to overall layout, is kind of maintaining that parking as close to or along Monona Drive as feasible, with grades, topography, drainage, and kind of blending it in so you're keeping as much of the property towards the lake. So that was 55%. 56% of the responses. B is the smaller lots, the two small lots kind of around the ring road that go along with the open shelter concept, and then the larger single lot at about 27%. Let's say one other thing that was, I think, kind of interesting that came out of the results thus far is from those who have taken the survey, fairly low importance of boat pier access. I think looking into the comments and digging into that data a little bit more, it looks like some of that is referencing partly to that a lot of people have a perception, and which is accurate, that the water is shallow around the site. So having a large pier and bringing in a lot of boats isn't a high priority for many. The amphitheater also ranked fairly low in that as one of the potential uses. Fishing pier is a little more kind of mixed. Higher percentage was kind of indifferent or medium importance. But as you go in, paved walking paths, the natural space, community gardens, outdoor patio space, gathering areas, beach, natural play, open lawn are all important to those who have taken the survey thus far.
I think one thing about the amphitheater to consider, if you want to continue to keep that in the thoughts of the plan, I think a lot of people, it's scale perceptions. And they think it's this big amphitheater that it's going to be in their backyards of the people that live nearby. When we didn't really show a scale, and it wasn't anticipated to be a big amphitheater. It's just a small gathering space. So I think we can talk our way through that if you want to carry that on through to the master and present it as a small gathering space.
When do you anticipate us deciding what we want in the master plan? Because we haven't looked at all the surveys, so like next month, is that, we're gonna get into that in a little more detail, you think?
I would think so, because that was why I was asking about the buildings and having Alexis talk about the buildings, because I think we're there now for the buildings.
Right, I do too.
Because they're pretty even. But this will give you a better idea of what you can do with the three types of structures. And if the programming works, and that's why I was saying we can't drill down into the actual programming, because that's a huge endeavor. But we can get far enough into discussion to understand how spaces could be used for certain types of programs. And so that'll get you through the building part of the master plan, and then later this summer, next month or the month after, we can start focusing on the elements that are preferred and least preferred, and what you want to carry through, how you want to carry it through.
I think we need cost estimates for every component.
There was a lot of questions
Right,
for
yeah.
cost.
I mean, I don't know how we decide on,
Right.
and it kind of relates to the next topic, but how do we make a decision about a facility? We don't know what it's gonna cost.
So one observation that I didn't get through the entire packet, but I made a whack at it. One thing that on parking that seemed fairly consistent was not much appetite for parking. Like people want to limit parking. And sometimes it was in conjunction with they wanted an event center. But they didn't, you know, so that seemed,
Yeah, some of it
that
was,
sort of to me, maybe informs what we're can do on the site, because depending on. If we don't provide a lot of on-site parking, is there enough off-site parking or other ways for people to get there to still do the events that we want to do? But I think people would throw a fit if we built a big parking lot.
yeah, and a lot of people really like the parking near the street. And was that, how many, was that 30
Yeah.
spots in that one? I mean, I think we would make that a little bit bigger, couldn't we? 30 isn't.
I don't know,
Yeah,
how
it
many,
was the
how many,
middle size one. So A was about 50.
how many did we park like the other night? Didn't we park a bunch
There was on the grass,
on the grass?
over towards the exit. There was.
Right.
On Friday
You have an
night.
idea of like how many?
I was.
There wasn't a lot of parking allowed on the grounds.
And those are mainly volunteers, employees,
Yeah.
members of the band,
People got there first.
yeah.
Parking is a big issue for that site in terms of its use, but particularly if we're gonna program and put money into refurbishing a building and trying to build a building and possibly bring in money.
There were a couple comments on that side of leaving along parking. But it wasn't very many.
Yeah, we're gonna have to be practical, I think.
People are parking over at Lake Edge. Cause I happen to be up there at the bicycle shop right at that time, and I was pulled in and I was like, why is this parking lot? Oh, yeah.
That's not good.
I got here at just a little bit after 5, and I was on Winnequa down by the other park. Then, and cars were already starting to park up and down there at 5.
And I drove up there about 4:45 and there wasn't much
Yeah.
that far at all. Well, I think, you know, certainly we're gonna need to think about maybe making some kind of arrangement with the high school, with Habitat on Sunday and Monday, you know, is there some kind of, for big events, is there something you can do with a shuttle, you know? There's just,
Doesn't Steve Doran own Lake Edge now?
yeah, Steve Dorn does own Lake Edge now.
Could he be open to, no, because most of those businesses are not open.
True.
Except on the weekend or the day.
I think Carver has a good example of when an event's done, they send out a map and highlight other areas in the park. And I'm sure they've made some sort of agreements or arrangements with those businesses.
Yeah, because that's really a limited, and I do think we need to talk about having some kind of one or two of those flashing crossing light things that people can turn on crossing Monona Drive, because we've heard from several people about how, you know, taking their life in their hands, running across Monona Drive at night, trying to get over there and And we have to agree with Madison, I guess, on both sides.
Mayor,
So Aldo Leopold has a lot of parking. I'm looking at the map. It has a lot of parking over there.
The nature center?
And
No, not really.
the drop off.
That's Tellurian has, so there's.
Oh, over to
multiple-
that.
Yeah,
South side.
Right. Nancy, did you have something?
yeah, I just would, in the interest of time, and I'm seeing Alexis here again, being patient, I don't want to go too far down a detailed rat hole, over something like, parking if, but I was just gonna suggest, well, I was just gonna offer two things as it relates to a question that was just asked as in kind of when are we gonna decide, the other elements, and I just was wondering if Dan might relay. My understanding from the original timeline was that he was going to be going out and going back out in one form or another to share the concept plans with the focus group folks.
That's on the agenda, I think.
Yeah.
Right, and so I'm just saying, it seems to me that needs to happen before we get into deciding. Because the whole intent of going back out to the focus groups, I don't know, I'm asking the question, number
Yeah.
one, do we need to do the focus groups to go back out first before we get to deciding, or do we need to decide on a concept and go back out? So that's number one. And number two is just in relation to the boating dock. I just keep going back to something that Mary Lee said, I think at the last meeting, which is it not unlike people saying, it being fairly even on the house versus a new facility, but people saying they like the house, but they're concerned that it's too old. And so the outcome was that the new facility came out ahead when asked to rank first, second, or third. I think people similarly are making the assumption that it's too shallow. And so they may be sort of leaning against a pier because they're trying to be the architect, in a sense, rather than the value of the pier. And as Mary Lee said at the last meeting, boats are going to come into the facility whether there's a pier for them or not. And so, or whatever's there. And so, I think when we get to deciding that, one of the things that we need to think about is exactly that, which is if we don't have a pier, then our boats are going to be coming up on the shore and climbing up on the bank and using the kayak beach or whatever to try to get to the shore, in the absence of a pier, and that's probably not what we want. And Mary Lee's already said that it's possible to put a pier there. Doesn't mean that it's always super deep, but it is definitely possible to do that, given. So I just would offer those two things.
Okay. Did you guys have anything else more to talk about the survey? And we can.
Well, real quick on Dan, we can talk about focus group here. I was just gonna talk about that, but we'll wait till C.
Okay.
Focus group.
So do we want to go on to have Alexis do a presentation? Oh, okay. Alexis, are you ready to start?
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so I'll share my screen, and then I'll probably turn my camera off while I'm presenting, just to make sure just that little extra push to make sure the internet connection stays okay. So let's see. Share. Okay. Make you guys bigger again. I said I was going to turn myself. Oh, I lost my control for that. Went to a different screen. Okay. Yeah. So, some of you heard 5 to 10 minute version of this quick run through back in February, but I know some people were not there for that moment of that meeting or at that meeting. So for those that heard it, some of it will sound a little repetitious, but hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to kind of walk through each of the things in a little more methodic fashion than we did that day. And so really just, there were 3 overall concepts for the architecture really to align with and fit within the 3 different site concepts that MSA has developed. So, that first one, concept A, with rehabbing the house, and concept B, removing the house and providing an open shelter and separate restroom building. And then concept C, removing the house and replacing it with a new, full-fledged facility. Concept A with you can kind of see, this is just a shot of the mural board here that shows kind of all of those different options kind of laid out for the different concepts. And you can see there are 3 different kind of sub options for rehabbing the house for concept A, and then a couple different options for each site concept B and site concept C. And then I'm going to actually switch to slides that will show each sub concept separately so that we can kind of zoom in and focus on those a little bit easier. So let's see here. So talking about rehabbing the house with site concept A, going through these sub concepts will take just a little bit longer to walk through than the kind of the concepts for site option B and C, just because of the complexity of talking it through with the house and that kind of thing. So hang with me on these sub concepts here. But really, these were, with all of these sub concepts looking at the house, this is really just simple block diagrams and exploring a range of feasible programming that could work within the general massing or the square footage of the existing house, as well as looking to take advantage of opportunities of like the key historic spaces and the view sheds to the lake that the architecture does provide. So they're not meant to be exclusive or exhaustive, but simply kind of an exercise of some possibilities, what might work or fit within the footprint of the house, the existing house, how it might transform and how we might be able to adaptively reuse the architecture there, but certainly looking to accommodate the program that we know you're kind of looking to address in somewhat fashion in terms of educational space, possibly some interpretive space, and bringing in the public in some capacity to the space, and also trying to look at considering revenue producing potential and ability of whatever those spaces are to help with that idea. So certainly you can mix and match ideas between the sub concepts. We can look at other things that aren't maybe represented here, if other people had other ideas, or if we took it to public for comment. And then certainly if we pursue any of these concepts, whether it's the rehab concepts or some of the new construction concepts, we would certainly, obviously, as we were kind of talking previously in this meeting, want to follow up with some feedback on that program, sort of establish that, work towards that initial program that you want to flush out and show as your vision in the master plan and move forward with. But then you would want to probably follow up with a more detailed programming and certainly the design phases, the normal design phases, to work through it in more detail, kind of following that master plan process. And also the last comment is like a general kind of setting the stage. When we're particularly with the rehabbing the house on these sub concepts, we definitely wanted to think about the ability to phase that rehab, maybe one floor at a time. So looking at that first, obviously there's going to be some of that work that you would need to do in terms of, structural repairs or envelope repairs or systems upgrades. But in terms of fitting out the space and maybe even extending some of those systems or replacing them, looking at that first floor first, and then how you could kind of move up to the second and third floors as well. This first concept, sub-concept A1, really looking at this one as kind of a flexible, all-encompassing kind of multi-use space or programming. So space that would be reservable or leasable. So on that first floor, you see that main event room kind of taking advantage of that primary key historic space on the south end of the first floor there. And then a larger conference room with those big windows and views out to the lake, maybe a smaller meeting room, and then certainly the support spaces that might come along with that kind of spaces in terms of, coat room or, catering spaces, and then, storage for different furnishings or things like that that you might want to have to kind of switch out, whether you're having something with a whole bunch of seating or something with more tables and chairs, so that you have that flexibility and the space to kind of store those materials. And then, looking at things of trying to kind of restore the house a little bit, but also kind of open it up and, restore it to almost what it used to be in terms of, that extra vestibule on the front that's not original and very small tight quarters. So something like that can come off. Like, you don't need to spend money to, rehab something like that that's really not useful to you, but certainly removing things and kind of restoring that entry to something else does have dollar signs with it as well. But providing that accessibility into that first floor with a ramp up here to the side from the north, and then opening up those porches on both the east and west sides, and starting to introduce that kind of interior exterior space, occupiable exterior space and experience with the view sheds out to the lake as well. And so then this particular diagram explores putting, leasable or reservable office space up on that second floor, taking advantage of the larger bank of restrooms that are up there, certainly needing to kind of relay those out. And then one comment about how we're showing these diagrams in terms of the color blocks that you can kind of see through. The intent with that is to show how spaces might fit within the existing layout or confines, especially of the existing house, especially where we have corner fireplaces or the central hallway with the grand stair, whereas other places where certain walls are less important and we might explore kind of relaying those spaces out or changing some walls as we need to accommodate growth in programs. So, accessible restrooms, if you will, where it's showing janitor's closet, that's that tiny little powder room that's there now. So knowing that that's not going to work and we need an accessible restrooms on that floor. So just showing how some of the spaces kind of bleed over the existing footprint that you can see behind and floor plan. So you can see where we're looking at kind of, it might make sense to work within the existing footprint and where it might make sense to kind of relay out some of the spaces that have been broken down over time and changed over time. And then this particular sub option looks at taking that third floor space and kind of restoring that to what it used to be, which is a big open event space where Frank Alice would host, his big parties and things like that. So kind of reopening that back up to be a big flexible space on the upper floor. There's certainly no secret that the circulation is going to be one of the biggest challenges with adaptively reusing the house and bringing in, public programming and things like that. So we'll certainly need to look at, with any concept that rehabs the house, what is that final programming and use of the spaces? Therefore, what's the occupancy load and the capacity of the existing stairwells and the, code compliance with some of their features that they are now. So how much can we kind of grandfather things or reuse them, or how much do we kind of need to modify or look at changes to that in terms of having proper egress, particularly from the upper floors out. Certainly a concept like this where you're considering, a big public space on that third floor, then you're certainly looking at accessibility up to that third floor with an elevator. So kind of this dashed white box is intended to be sort of the starting discussion of where might something like that get put in, and how might we try to look at exploring how to meet that challenge and fit that through the house. So it certainly won't be easy, especially that third floor. One instinct is you want to utilize this larger vestibule, 3-room vestibule on the front, except that one, that's great if you're going up to the second floor, but it does not translate when you're down to a smaller dormer on that third floor. So But something to kind of look at and think about as we consider some of these choices. And then just some inspiration and precedent images for each of these. So, you know, how that historic house kind of feel might be reused. This is Cranbrook House here in Michigan, another historic home with, you know, beautiful woodwork on the inside. As you can see here, it looks like a piano recital at the end or a lecture space. And then other buildings, historic buildings that have been adaptively reused modified for some, you know, meeting spaces, conference spaces, as well as some office spaces and how that might kind of start to look inside the space. And then something like that, opening up that third floor attic space up there. And then let's keep moving. So the concept A2 instead takes a look at, find my notes here, really focusing more on that cultural education idea and really a center for that type of programming. So looking at the first floor, an interpretive or exhibit space here in that main southern room, and then really thinking about what is that, maybe like that something kind of capitalizing on that kind of farm to table idea. I know that there's the kind of small crop space or planting space that is there now that I think that you're looking at continuing through into one of the new concepts. I know Bill Quackenbush has talked about wanting to have a room to dry some of the crops inside the space. So transforming that old garage on the north end to something like that. And then you could kind of bring that in as some like kind of teaching kitchen, educational space, talking about culinary arts and things like that. And perhaps that even translates into this just sort of simple walk-up cafe where they're bringing, you know, people from the park might be open at certain times where people that are just enjoying the rest of the park can walk up and kind of look at some of the products that has been produced in that teaching kitchen from crops that are grown right on the site, or that kind of farm to table experience. And then some other, you know, taking advantage of those larger spaces for the kind of workshop spaces or libraries or reading rooms where people could find some resource information. Again, you know, accessibility into the space, support spaces like gift shops, things like that that can produce some revenue. And then this one kind of looks at that up second floor, and is there a way to combine some of those smaller rooms into larger classrooms that would accommodate full classrooms that may be coming from the elementary schools, et cetera, in each of those kinds of spaces. Just a side note that some of these, you may have noticed in some of these diagrams I was showing on the previous one and this one and the next one, do list a certain number of people. And that, well, those are the amount of people that you could probably comfortably fit in the space, considering kind of the programming that you're looking at. So if it's a classroom space with tables and chairs and a third grade class coming into the space after doing some programming out on the site, you know, based on the square footage and the layout, that this could probably accommodate a classroom of 25 or so. So your code occupancy maximums will be much higher than that, but in terms of what's feasible to use for the space. And then this one just explores that idea of what if you have support, admin, office space, or meeting space on that third floor, or maybe this is also that kind of leasable, rentable space that's transitional for different groups to use at different various times, or meeting community groups, that kind of thing as well. So the precedent images on this one, you can see kind of different iterations of interpretive spaces. Again, some in historic homes, looking at different culture that has happened in those different environments and areas. And then that kind of crop drying space that Bill was looking for, and that kind of teaching kitchen to that small walk-up cafe kind of thing, and that farm to table experience, as well as some of those classroom spaces that we were looking at on the second floor, and just sort of how that could kind of materialize in those spaces. And then the third, oops, nope, I didn't advance it. There you go, let's try that. The third sub option that we looked at with the house includes really looking at it more as like a dedicated art center for the community. So again, on that first floor space, that largest historic space on the south end there, suitable for that exhibit or kind of a performance space. Another event space in that larger room with the large windows looking out towards the lake. Again, some of the supporting spaces, like a gift shop. In this case, you might have ticketing or an administrative office. Perhaps there's kind of a quieter reflection space with that larger porch off to towards the lake end. Again, catering support, which I think I had shown we had shown in that first option with the multi-purpose rooms. This particular option starts to take a look at if you needed to support restrooms within the house, maybe for at least just that side of the site, and maybe there's a separate smaller restroom facility kind of on the other side of the site, where would you maybe try to accommodate that? Whereas the previous two sub options, really, we were just looking at restrooms that would deal with the capacity that's just for specific functions happening within the house, and using that second floor restroom space to accommodate all 3 floors. So that that's what's nice about putting those on the second floor. If we have accessibility to that second floor, it can really accommodate functions within the house. But this is just that one of, if you start to look at accommodating outside use and maybe limiting people to just that area, as opposed so that they're not able to get into the rest of the house when there are not functions or when it's not open for other times of the day. This kind of north end might accommodate that a little bit more better than the others. This second floor looks at then are these kind of art studio spaces. They could again be classroom spaces or educational or spaces like that, but maybe they're leasable, rentable art studios that people could have. And then this third floor just brings in the idea of the concept of either that kind of live work studio environment, if someone is leasing these art studio spaces below and has a permanent exhibit or semi-permanent exhibit on the first floor, having some studio apartments, breaking that third floor up into a couple studio apartments. We actually have there's a lighthouse in Michigan, northern Michigan, that is open to the public for tours, and the first floor is mostly restored to its period of interpretation, and people can come in and see what it looks like would have looked like to live there with the family and the dwelling back, in the 1800s, and lots of exhibit spaces. But the upper floor of that dwelling is not accessible, and it would have been detrimental or difficult or cost prohibitive to make that second floor of that lighthouse dwelling accessible. So what they decided to do in that case is make a little studio apartment that people can, it's just a nice vacation rental. People just reserve it online and come. And so they know it's not an accessible space before they're signing up for it. So it's pretty cool, because then people get to say, oh, I get to go stay in the lighthouse and see what it was kind of like in that remote location. So kind of thinking about that as a possibility for the site with beautiful views out to the lake, or that kind of live work cultural artistic studio concept.
Alexis,
Yeah.
so wait, sorry, I was just gonna ask a question
Yeah.
about that. So, because it relates to the elevator really on all.
Yeah, I
things.
was actually just about to say one more thing about that, but go ahead.
Yeah,
Kelly,
which
you're
is
gonna
if-
ask it.
if there are spaces, whether it's an art studio or an office, if it's spaces in the upper floors that are not utilized for public programming.
Yes.
Do
Perfect.
they have to be accessible?
Yeah, that is exactly, you and I were on the same wavelength, because that was the other thing that was the last thing I was going to mention. So on these last two, I know the first one I showed you had that clearly public event kind of space up on that third floor. If we were to put the office, kind of just leasable office space or admin space, or these, like we were just talking through, these apartment spaces on the third floor, we may be able to say these are not open to the public. We let people know ahead of time that they're not accessible. If we need to accommodate an office space, on, you know, an accessible floor, we can certainly do that to provide that equality. And then therefore we might be able to just do a lift, like an open space, open air lift that would be much more cost effective and less impactful to the house than having to do an elevator, a small elevator that goes up through all 3 floors. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is we might be able to explore that from a code compliance standpoint and accessibility standpoint, and avoid needing to make the 3rd floor accessible.
Thank you.
Oops. And then just lastly, the precedent images, kind of then inspirations that we pulled for this one. You can see, you know, like obviously a gift shop oriented towards local artisans and exhibiting and selling their products. What that exhibit space might look like, flexible exhibit space, performance space might look like in a historic building. Those art studios on that 2nd floor. And then this is a picture of that lighthouse studio apartment that's a vacation rental that's rentable online. And then just something, these are little plans that are actually to the scale of the square footage that those 2 studio apartments on the 3rd floor might be like, so that you can kind of see it would actually be enough space to create a little individual apartment and to be able to fit a couple of those up there. I know it seems really tight when you're up there now, but you know, remembering that you would be, you know, removing that central corridor and some of those walls to kind of relay out the space. So looking at concept B, which is really the separate restrooms or the open pavilion or shelter or a combination thereof. So looking at just some options for, you know, different ways to configure just restroom only kind of buildings, having kind of that men's and women's restroom separation, and then possibly a family restroom in the center, you know, some support space. Perhaps there's overhangs or canopy seating around that, you know, accessibility up into that, and looking at different, you know, more interesting ways to possibly kind of arrange some of those spaces, create that indoor-outdoor function. Really though, simple, efficient, something that is easy to maintain and clean, but also creative ways to celebrate the natural materials and have them fit in with the landscape. Also ways that perhaps you can introduce indigenous design inspirations, or perhaps if the house is removed, then we're talking about maybe there are materials we can salvage from the house, or design concepts or details, you know, that are inspired by the house that we can start to introduce into even, you know, something as simple as restroom or pavilion architecture kind of thing. And then taking a look at, you know, pavilion only. So some inspiration images or precedents of different creative ways to look at that and have that blend in with the landscape. Even including this kind of long, obviously you have your traditional rectangular pavilions, different seating that might work for, you know, school groups, things like that, that's flexible, simple, cost effective, and even this long linear design that is clearly more intended for facilitating interpretation of some kind of permanent or semi-permanent exhibits, but also could serve as space for gathering for students and things like that, or groups. And then, you know, some of these kind of indigenous inspired places or smaller shelters, perhaps things that could be explored for the different nodes that MSA is showing in some of the concepts that they have. And other thing in terms of kind of combining those ideas, in terms of if you have, you know, one location may just have restrooms only, but another location on the site on the other side may, where that open air pavilion or shelter is, may also of course then want to have restrooms nearby or adjacent or kind of attached and combined. So, you know, pretty basic, simple, you know, diagramming of a large open air space, supporting restrooms and storage area, but perhaps there's, you know, a central fireplace or some kind of communal element like that, similar to a concept that was carried through in the house. And then this one starting to look at, you know, is there a way to also have design that open air space that is still then kind of can be broken down into some smaller zones, so that if you want to break your school groups into 4 different groups and have them kind of cycle through different stations, looking at different ways to think about that. So again, here's just some images that kind of introduce that concept of combining restrooms with pavilion and shelter space adjacent that could be programmed for things like that. And then taking a look at concept C, site concept C, where you have a completely new construction facility. So similar to what we were just looking at with the restrooms and the pavilion, just looking at different ways, you know, simple ways to just lay out with, this is the program that we know that you're kind of generally looking at, but we can certainly expand upon that program or scale these up and down, add additional elements. So that would be kind of that next layer of if we were to explore this, or if we wanted to have discussion about how we wanted to show the public for comment some different iterations with different, you know, program combinations, we could easily do that. So, but for now, just kind of showing as a starting point, you know, that main education or event space with the supporting spaces around it in terms of restroom storage, utilities, possibly adding that catering space in as well. And then that kind of spill over to exterior space where you could, you know, a nice thing would be able to open that interior space up and have it kind of spill up out into that exterior covered space, or make that space larger on a nice day, nice weather day. So this particular, we also just did kind of a quick sizing exercise. So if you were looking to accommodate 100 people with movable tables and chairs, you know, what's that kind of recommended square foot per person, that's your minimum that you'd be looking at, and what's that square footage, and therefore like how big of a building are you talking about? And then if that's the kind of capacity and occupancy you're looking at, what does that mean for support spaces such as restrooms based on fixture count and that kind of thing. So again, we could scale this up, down, depending on the specific program that you kind of think you want to incorporate and accommodate. So some images again on different examples of those new construction kind of facilities set within you know, a natural landscape. Some also pulling from different cultural inspirations specific to the region or area, and then kind of what those interior spaces could look like. Again, a kind of a range and scale of some things that are smaller, some that are a little bit more grand, and everything kind of in between. So that's that. And then the last couple of things I wanted to touch on would just be, then we did kind of leave a placeholder for you know, a second sub-concept for that concept C, where you have a new structure. So really that's just a placeholder for, as I was talking on the last page, we've shown a couple of basic plans of that main event space and the supporting space. But if you wanted to show a larger program or a program with multiple spaces that, you know, kind of above and beyond what we were showing on that previous page, we could create a second sub-concept if that's something we wanted to present to the public or get feedback on as part of this process. And then this second area here on this sheet is really talking about, you know, for really options, concepts B or C, where we're talking about removing the house and creating new architecture. Already kind of mentioned the idea of, are there indigenous architectural concepts that we might want to bring into play to also, you know, that's another layer of interpretation or storytelling that can occur if we kind of incorporate some of those inspirations into whatever new designs we're creating for the site. But also the footprint of the house. So the existing house that's being removed, is there a way to still then interpret that story and that history and that place, whether it be just sort of an outline in the landscape, but that maybe has a dual purpose. You know, this one's looking like kind of a gathering space for groups or students, and maybe that's where that house footprint was. Or is it more of a simple structure or a ghosting of some kind, that it becomes something else that does not blocking that view shed to the lake? That I know that that's one advantage of removing the house. You achieve that kind of open view at that side of the site to the lake. And then, as we were also mentioning in some of the other items, in terms of bringing in design concepts that are detailing that you see in the house, whether it's the tile at the fireplace, some of the woodwork detail, the tracery in the windows, just simply some of the materials that are used, or some of that kind of detailing as well. So, and then finally, the last sheet we had was, this is sort of a perhaps a little bit more kind of thinking outside the box, but want to just put certain things out there so that we, you know, think of any kind of inspirational idea or income producing potential that the site might be able to offer. So thinking about impermanent structures, you know, and really in this case, kind of a tiny cabin or tent structures that might find their way into certain corners or pockets of the site that could be rentable by groups or just by individuals to come and stay and kind of experience the views and the nature, but something that can be removable from the land easily. It's a light impact. And then looking at kind of how you might lay something like that out on the site, like perhaps there's a cluster of some that could be used by, you know, a scout group or something where they want to kind of be together and have that communal feel, versus putting some of them, scattering them within the trees and the landscapes for more of a secluded, you know, retreat style kind of experience. And so just showing kind of some different options of what that could look like on the site, but, you know, certainly thinking about something that's low impact, easy to kind of maintain. And it could be even something that's vendor managed. There's a couple of organizations that run these kinds of things and provide them. And so that's really just not something that you're burdened with, but that you're just paying someone to have rights to some of the spaces and land. But that could be used, you know, this idea could be something that could be used to supplement those other concepts, the concepts that MSA has shown, and sort of used, you know, implemented in addition to or not. So just kind of floating some maybe outside the box ideas as well, in addition to the others. So, but that's all the architecture concepts we had. I know that was kind of a lot with some of the sub-concepts for rehabilitating or adaptively reusing the house, as well as some of the new construction ideas. So I don't know if anybody has any other questions, or the last thing I would say too is these dollar signs that you see. These are really just meant to be kind of comparative between the concepts or sub-concepts. So, you know, that initial, as I was saying at the beginning, you know, phasing of a rehabilitation of the house would certainly be a little bit more for that first phase in terms of some of the repairs or new systems or things that you would need to do, as well as the first floor being certainly the largest of the footprint. So the cost of working on that floor and getting that floor ready to go and occupiable definitely being higher than, you know, what it would take to kind of finish the fit out and complete or extend things to those upper floors. So it's more of kind of that comparative of costs between the floors, or, you know, this doing that work to rehab the house and the first floor and getting that ready for occupancy being comparative to go to the right page here, building a new structure altogether, you know, that's new construction. So and I think the intention is MSA, you're looking at, you know, one of the next steps is cost estimating on a more thorough scale, but for now, just kind of giving that comparative look.
Anyone have any questions? Anyone on Zoom? I can't see all of you.
I just have a quick comment.
Andy?
Is I know the elevator was brought up, but I know I'm not a voting member, but I would say my personal feeling is anything that we recommend, if it's a city facility, every floor needs to be accessible by everyone. I mean, because you cannot know who your staff is gonna be, you cannot know who is visiting, I mean, and then I just think, especially saving the house, if you think about preserving it, making it historic and making it a place that people want to see. But then somebody on a wheelchair or whoever is coming and saying, oh, well, you can only come to the first floor, or, you know, this event's on the second floor for whatever reason, but, you know, we have it on Zoom or something. So I have maybe an inadequate visceral reaction when I think about not having every floor of a city building accessible to everybody. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah.
I have a question, and this is kind of, you know, a crazy time to bring it in, but have we thought about maintaining the facade along Monona Drive so it looks like the Frank Alice house, and doing something really creative and kind of melding them both on the lakeside? Is that something that is even feasible?
I think that's sort of what Wes is gonna be addressing later, a little bit, right?
It's a great question.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the architecture perspective and preservation perspective and adaptive reuse perspective, anything is, it's sort of, the answer is almost anything is possible. It's always about, you know, is it cost effective? Is it fit your, you know, vision? What is the vision? What is the budget? What, you know, that kind of, those are some of the questions, but certainly, you know, you can kind of blend, you know, more, because it's not, I know it's protected by the landmark status with the county, I believe. But previous decisions have been that it is not, you know, on the register or historic district. So there are less limitations there, therefore, so it can be, it gives you that freedom to be even more creative if you want to, in terms of like really opening up the facade and really kind of transforming it, you know. So that's one extreme versus, you know, really trying to restore it to its original historic form, which would mean, you know, things like, you know, I talked about taking off that smaller you know, addition vestibule, but for this first larger 3-room vestibule is also not original. So it just happens to be older than the smaller one in the front. So, and taking that one off would certainly, it's, again, everything is possible, but that one does have a basement. The basement was extended underneath that, and the way that the windows or the rooms have been modified, you know, on this original wall. So there'd certainly be a lot more cost to taking, you know, something like this back off and restoring that original facade facing Monona Drive if you really wanted to go back to the original character. But then there's, you know, the other extreme of, you know, really opening it up in a different way and kind of melding new versus old. And I had here, this is not necessarily the most, this is a little dated in terms of what you're seeing here, but it is really, I was looking for an image that explored that concept, speaks to that concept that Marilee was asking about, where clearly you have an older historic home and the way that they were opening that up and kind of modernizing it at the same time. So certainly a dated version of that example, and not necessarily what I'd be suggesting that look exactly, but that idea for sure.
Anybody else? Well, thank you, Alexis, and definitely food for thought.
That's the idea.
Well, should we just have Wes give his input and then we can talk about the, switch things up a little bit about the focus group open house? Wes, do you wanna?
Sure, so this is, think of this as a due diligence topic. And related to the house in particular, and we're talking about, I mean, we're getting all sorts of feedback from the public about what people want to see do, what type of facilities are needed, desired. We're having those discussions as well. And it was interesting as I was reading through all the responses, hearings, and seeing the data too. It's, you know, this is not a clear cut situation. And I think I was also struck by the number of comments regarding desire for more financial transparency and understanding of what's this going to cost. And I think, you know, in a lot of comments, you know, that were kind of to the tune of it's hard to evaluate different concepts without understanding the costs. And so I think as we think about the house options, I think understanding what it would, you know, what more so than $2 signs, you know, what is a rehabilitation project actually going to mean and how much of that costs? And then also understanding, you know, what a new building would cost, and weighing those issues in the context of what are we trying to accomplish? And then also knowing that we're gonna have to put together a plan to bring to the council that spells out, you know, what of this entire concept, what's gonna be publicly funded, what's gonna be city of Monona taxpayer funded, what's gonna be privately funded, and, you know, when we think about the funds we have to raise, knowing that that's gonna be a significant piece of it, as well as what's it gonna cost to operate the park and so on and so forth. So we have to sort of start dealing with these issues and putting together something that makes sense. So when I think about, you know, looking at the house, to me, a big question is, you know, is eligibility on the National Register and our historic tax credits even possible to contribute towards the cost of a project? So that's why we did a walkthrough. The mayor and Rebecca and I did a walkthrough with Diana Benkunas, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and Paul Porter, who's one of the tax credit reviewers, just to open up that discussion and get a reaction, get them in the house, understand, you know, their view on whether it's worth it to even consider an application. Again, on 2007, there was an application put forward, and at that point, it was denied. And so the question was really, is there anything we can do to this house to bring it back to a condition where an application could be successful? And that's an important question because, you know, if it's possible, then potentially we could be eligible for 40% tax credits, 20% state, 20% federal. And that could potentially make a project like that much more feasible. And there's a lot of different examples where municipalities have partnered with the private sector to deliver projects like that. And again, we'd have to come back to what we think as a steering committee we want to do and actually accomplish through the program. But at some point we could marry those things up and at least have a better idea of, you know, is there something we can do in the house that's financially feasible? So what we learned in our walkthrough is that the preservation, Dinah and Paul thought, you know, in its 1893 form, the house is a great example of Georgian revival architecture. But as we know, there's been a number of modifications over time. And so it doesn't look much like it did then. But it seemed that the sentiment was a major barrier to reapplication would be the addition that's been added to the front. So if we were, I forget what year that was added.
Before 1930.
Yeah, so if we, in theory, take the addition off the house, knowing that the original siding is there, a lot of the original elements in the interior are present. There's a pretty strong sentiment from Dinah and Paul that it's, you know, would be possible to resubmit an application and that potentially the house could be eligible. So that would take some work to do. Require some.
Yep, take care of that.
Obviously, but that's kind of where we are in terms of the walkthrough and we got Diana. I think to Mayor Lee's point, question, you know, there's a lot that can be negotiated when it comes to what you can do in the property and to what extent, you know, we were talking about, you know, the sleeping porch is an original. Would that need to come off in the discussion, you know, centered around? Perhaps not. There are certainly strong elements in the interior of the stairway, the, you know, finishes that have been preserved. Some things would likely need to stay in the interior, but there's a lot of spaces that have been that are not original. It wouldn't preclude us from doing an addition on the back of the house, rethinking and rehabbing, parts of the house. So I think there's quite a bit of flexibility there, potentially. But it certainly is a process to kind of to work through. And there's a number of steps that we'd have to go through. I think just some initial cost estimates, we'd want to understand from the start, start to finish, what are we looking at? But I think that's true with any of the scenarios that we're looking at. For a new building, that's, I don't know what our square footage is, but that's, $3 to $4 million at minimum. I would think, not including the cost to demolish this, the Frank Alice house. So there's just a ton of things for us to think about as we're dreaming about what we want to do. Thinking about the practical elements. We'd have to raise some initial funds to take off the front. There'd be a process to get to the point of application.
Is that what they said, that it would need to go back to the 1893 exterior?
Yeah,
I just wanted to.
yeah, and I think
confirm.
my sense from
weren't sure on
Dino was that
but
she was very interested in the look of this house from the front. And that addition that's the thing that's the barrier at this point.
Yeah.
So we have to, and we wouldn't know, we take it off and see what's there. So it's, these things require, one step at a time. But if we're going to demolish it anyways, that would, it's one step of it's.
Sure.
Look at it as well, first step of demolition, perhaps. It'd require a unique delivery model. We'd have to partner with a developer and we can talk more about that later, how these happen, but this, the city would be driving that process. So that's kind of a high level sort of snapshot of what we, step we've taken, but then, what we would have to do to continue to evaluate the possibility. But I think it would, assuming, 40% of a $5 million project is $1 million. So that's it could be, when we look at all in the costs of the remaining purchase costs, above the city's going to put 4 million in, and the county 2, and there's 2.7 remaining, plus all the non-facility investment that's going to be required. We're talking about some significant costs for this entire plan to happen. So I think that's why it got started with its due diligence. It's understanding, what's the range of magnitude that we're talking about. A rehab, but also, looking at it in the same way in terms of a new building. So
I had a question about how the tax credits would work, and I guess at this point it's just enough for you there is a way to make them work, because obviously the tax credits don't do the city any good.
yeah, the city would have to partner with the private sector basically, and the credits are sold there's a market of tax credits that are sold, and so you work with a bank and work with a developer, work with an entity that's formed, and those credits end up finding their way back into the capital stack. And so the rest of the money would come through combination of fundraising, and then potentially, if the use of the house eventually has our income stream, that could also, be used in terms of some debt financing too. So really it could create a way to deliver something in the house that would be in a different way than simply writing a check.
Right. Well, it's very helpful what you presented today.
I just, and this may be not.
There's a couple of questions.
Answer.
Screen.
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask the question first. What would it mean if we did have a public-private partnership? Then are we ceding like ownership of the building to the private partner, or how does that? It stays a public.
I think a lot of this
Or how does that work?
depends
I
on
don't
how we
understand.
structure an RFP or a lease, so a lot of that is subject to, I think we want to think about what is the use.
Yeah.
That we're intending, and then how would you structure
So it could be a lease or something like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if it's I don't know, let's just think of a really simple model. If it's a coffee shop, that's one of the uses, then lease the space.
But would they be getting the tax credits then, or what happens to the people who get the tax credits?
They purchase them.
They purchase them, it's kind of like we were selling those sustainability credits for our solar panels,
Oh, right. Oh,
you know,
correct,
that
yeah.
same kind of deal.
Yeah.
They get sold, Mary, and we get cash. The whole idea is that we get cash to do the construction.
Okay.
And they're sold on the, in essentially an open market, if you will.
I think that one thing that I caught Wes saying is, I think the RFP is dictated and authored by the city, so it's really kind of under those guidelines, obviously. Open enough that the developer, and by developer, it would be rehabbing the house. I don't want developer term to think condos. But a developer would have to have the bandwidth enough to be interested in it. Am I correct in that thinking? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that have to line up, but you're basically creating the city's determining the use and the goals and the intent and
not seeing ownership.
right.
Okay. Mary Lee and then Nancy.
Yeah, I'm incredibly excited about all three ideas coming together, the indigenous people and the opening of having food there is incredibly exciting to me. Having the Frank Ellis house from Monona Drive is exciting to me. What could be towards the lake is also exciting to me. Is there any way we can meld these three? And I'm going to say something, I'm sorry, but business in the front, party in the back, kind of thing. Can we make it look the way it is in the front and open it up to the back and, invite a more, that's easier to get to. We don't have to do special elevators and special places because it's open in the back. And I really am hoping, and I don't know if, we've talked about indigenous people, if there's funding there, if they would be included, but to be able to meld all three of these together, I would think would just be an incredible win-win for Monona.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of that idea with that second sub-concept where it's like you're melding the agriculture piece with the indigenous piece in terms of the crops and that teaching and education with the education groups and that kind of farm to table, but then also kind of accommodating just the public being out at the space and kind of enjoying the waterfront, and certainly fishing. I don't know if that could be introduced as well, but yeah, then that cafe is just providing a service, and it makes it nicer for people to come there and know that they can get a snack or a treat while they're hanging out on the shoreline, but also then kind of get a little history and experience as part of that, as opposed to just same old cafe, so that they're feeling like they're part of the story, and it's sort of the living story of the site. But yeah, I think how much you could open up the back, it sort of depends on, in terms of architecturally, would this definitely depend on whether you went down the road of the tax credits and listing the property or not. But I would agree with, kind of the assessment report that was given in terms of, I think it's still possible to list this property. I sort of disagreed with that original assessment that was given before, that it was too much integrity is lost. I think there's some restoration that could occur, especially with that piece on the front coming off, and the bulk of the primary or character defining features or elements or forms are still present and repairable.
Nancy, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I certainly concur with Mary Lee that there's elements of all three. First of all, Alexis, I want to thank you for the thorough walking through. I'm sorry that it took us so long to get there. But I concur. I mean, in my view, I kind of see it as a merge of a few of those concepts for the old house, which is to say, I think of it as cultural arts and education as opposed to just cultural or just, something else. But I concur with Mary Lee that you know, we've said from the very beginning that this has to be, in order for us financially to be successful, that this has to be a Lake Monona destination, not just a City of Monona Park. And to me, that means that there does have to be, and also that it has to be financially sustainable. And so to me, that really speaks to the whole issue of, I don't know if it's party in the back, but definitely, you know, kind of a cafe and maybe a teaching kitchen as well. That could be, you know, leased out to someone else. And Mary, to your point earlier about public-private partnerships, is Wes putting out there all kinds of public-private partnerships. And in fact, I Googled public-private partnerships in parks in Madison, and then did the same thing for Dane County, knowing we have a conservation easement. And, you know, just as a few examples, you know, the duck pond is owned wholly by the city of Madison. And, but it's a public-private partnership in terms of who runs it. Breeze Stevens Field is owned wholly by the city of Madison Park and Rec. And it's, you know, it's leased to Live Nation. So those are bigger ones, but there are definitely smaller ones as well. So I think those, and again, the city of Madison doesn't lose control of any of it, but they turn it over to somebody whose core competency is to do whatever it is that we decide we want to do on the property.
I guess my question revolved more around the tax credits and how that worked with the
Right.
public-private partnership.
Right.
Does anybody else have any?
I just have a
Tony?
question for Wes as a clarification. You know, with getting these tax credits and the steps that we'd be going through to remove the front of the house and expose that. And let's say, you know, we do get that approval, can we still rent in the house and do all this kind of, you know, wall tearing down and, you know, like to what standard and are we being held to preserve and exactly, you know, what aspects of the house do we have to keep, you know, pristine and to the time period as opposed to including all these new ideas?
I think a lot of it's to be determined. So I think there's a certain amount of elements that need to maintain it. So if the facade is you know, a big concern, then that's important. But I think when we walked the house, we heard that there were elements in the front room, the stairway, that were important, a lot of those fireplaces. But any of the elements that have been redone, you know, I think are subject to a lot of change that's open to us. So it is, you know, it's hard to say. We don't know exactly.
When you, I can speak to this a little bit.
Yeah.
I work in this.
Hang on, Rebecca. Rebecca's just talking a minute, just a minute.
When you use historic tax credits, you have to follow application process, and that's why we had Paul Porter there. He's the application reviewer. He's the reviewer for any of the architectural elements. So when you come up with an idea, you have to submit that to the Park Service through your SHPO. So at first your state has to approve it, and then the federal has to approve it. And there's a set of standards that you have to follow through the Park Service, and there's preservation briefs on, you know, like 60 some things on what you have to follow for.
And you're negotiating it throughout, you know, throughout
Yeah.
the entire process.
Yeah, and it's all up to, you know, your reviewer.
Got it. So
Alexis, did you have?
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, which is exactly right, but it would be the Secretary of Interior standards, but those standards have different kind of components and paths to them. So there's restoration, but there's also rehabilitation and things for new use. So you know, our experience working with the various SHPO offices and the Park Service, you know, they're there for they understand the paramount goal of preserving historic and important places and architecture, and that in order to do that, places need to remain relevant, and that adaptive reuse is part of that path. So, you know, we do this all the time with our projects and work with them. And so it would really be, you know, sometimes it's a historic structures report that does that historic research. and understands, here's the period of, establishes that period of significance for the property. And then those what are the character defining features of the architecture? What is the integrity, like what is still there and what's not? So that would define some of the key materials or spaces or forms that would either need to stay or be restored. And then where are the spaces that are less significant and that have, been modified over time and that, are more flexible for reuse. So they're pretty flexible about that approach. And I think as long as you're working with professionals that have experience in doing that kind of thing and facilitating that process and those designs, you can make it work. And some of those images that I was showing, even of like the conference spaces, those precedent images, some of those spaces, one of them is a Park Service headquarters for the Keweenaw National Park. And that space, that just conference room that you were looking at, is in an old mining town admin building. So, that room didn't look like that wasn't used for that space, but they put an entire national park headquarters in an old historic mining building. So, they have us looking at warehouse buildings and things from the 1800s, and they're trying to put in, adaptively reuse them or a bathhouse down in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and adaptively reuse that for archive storage buildings for their multiple parks. So the use can be really different, even in some cases, from where it started from. In this case, obviously, we're looking at a private home to a public functioning space, but that there's pathways for taking an old 20s bathhouse and making it office spaces or assembly space or storage space. So there's a lot that can be done within the confines and still respecting the important character defining historic elements of something.
You could add new spaces, you could tax credits for new construction, but we're thinking about, maybe it doesn't have the capacity that we want to bump out the back or something, could be part of the discussion.
Thanks for clarifying that for me. I think that's valuable information
Yeah.
to provide the public. Because I don't think a lot of people recognize that when you think of, historic places and preservation, that it has to be how it was from the beginning. And my experience of working with the Franklin Wright Foundation is like, you can't change anything that guy touched.
A little bit different story, yeah. Well, and that's exactly right, though. It depends on what it is and why it's important, and what made it historic and special. And so it can vary between them. And then certainly the exterior is a place where they tend to be less flexible and wanting you to really keep as much of that to that historic original character if it's still there. But there are certainly buildings that you need to change. You need to add windows in a certain spot, or you do have an addition that you're looking at. So all things are possible or accommodated. It sort of has to just work within that framework. And it depends on what those features are and the significance of that particular architecture and place, and then going through the process as other people were talking through. So there's steps to do that, and along the way, and it's where we have the most success too is where we have that relationship with the SHPO and the Park Service, from the beginning. So you start the conversations, you involve them in the decisions along the way, and therefore you don't get to the end and find out, oh, we've decided this is our design, and then show it to them and get their feedback, so that you're not waiting until that spot.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Anybody else? Well, thanks, Wes. I guess depending on how it would be good to know what it would cost to remove that front portion. And then, I assume building something in its place, back
Yeah, I think a next
the
step,
original look.
and I'll dig into this, is there's the cost to get it to the point where we would reapply. And then there's also some numbers around what a rehab project would cost in total,
Right.
and how might you structure that. And I think that's the piece that dig into a little bit more too and bring back. In the same way, I think we need to look at, you know, if we're looking at a different facility, what are we trying to accomplish? What's it gonna cost? What's it gonna cost to demolish, you know, the house? Let's say, you know, so that's like the all-in cost on that piece. I think we have to sort of, with all information in front of us, you know, we need to understand all of it before we really can make a decision.
Yeah.
And then I think Wes pointed out a point that we're not just talking about the house, we have paths, we have concrete floor. You know, we might have an amphitheater to build, right, you know, there's the nodes to put in, and that can certainly add up again.
Yeah, I think as we're preparing, as we're thinking about, you know, moving into decision mode, and even going from 3 to 1. I don't know if there's any sort of just ballpark figures for these nodes that we're talking about. You know, even if we're doing 10 nodes versus 5. That could be a huge swing in cost. So I mean, have any way that we can start getting that type of feasibility would be great.
I'm assuming something like paths, if you had a measurement,
Yeah, we
square
could
foot,
measure.
and based on what you're making.
We can measure paths and all. We just wanted to get past the concept.
I get it.
There's a lot of questions out there. How much is this gonna cost? And you know, looking at the site's comparable. All three concepts are gonna be pretty close in cost. Other than the parking, because one doesn't have very much parking at all, but it's maintaining the driveway, and the driveway will need to be replaced in that version. So actually, it's probably as much pavement at the end of the day, because you're making a big driveway. So I think the site's pretty close on all three of them, cost wise. The structures are totally different.
Nancy?
Yeah, I was just, I think we are kind of, you know, we're obviously inching towards making some choices. And I think one of the things that will be really important, you know, there's something that I think about all the time, which is, you know, if you say something once, it kind of comes and goes. And if you say something 10 times, people start to believe it. And I think that there's a messaging that needs to be stronger coming from this body, from the city, from the friends. And I know we've said it a million times, but we need to say it a million more. I mean, just judging from some of the comments on the survey that we continue to get, I think there's sort of 3 really critical things before we get into decision making that would just really be helpful to you know, have a bullhorn on. One is that this isn't just a Monona, that this isn't just a Monona Park. This needs to be a regional destination. This needs to be a Lake Monona destination. And I say that because, again, this is something we've said from the very beginning. It's not fundable anyway, you know, it's not fundable any other way. And it's not sustainable any other way. And I think it's, you know, I mean, it's not very many, but I'm still hearing some people say, you know, Monona's paying for this whole thing. And, you know, like, are we going to card people from Madison to make sure that they pay, you know, and that kind of thing. And I realize that might be a few people, but there still is misconception out there. I mean, Dane County's already paid for part of this. They've already made it a regional destination by committing $2 million to it, not to mention the stewardship fund. And as we move forward, that's going to be even more the case. So I would say that's number one, that we need to really keep messaging that this is more than a Monona Park, and it needs to be more than a Monona Park. And that doesn't mean that Monona is going to lose control, but that does mean that that needs to be created as a destination. Number 2, that we're going to be fundraising for any master plan, because there seems to be still a lot of people think that when they're talking about their taxes or when they're talking about the cost of San Damiano, especially as we get into other critical capital needs for the city, they're assuming that the city is going to keep forking out money for San Damiano. And as much as, you know, we keep saying otherwise, they they're not getting that message. So I think that's number two. Number three, that it has to be financially sustainable, not just in terms of the fundraising, but over the long haul. And that means revenue generation, ongoing revenue generation. So because I just see a lot of contradictions in the comments as I read through them, that, you know, people on the one hand were saying, I want it left untouched and I don't want anything on the property. And the other hand, they're complaining about how much it's costing. It's like, you can't have it both ways, you know? So I think that's also a really critical message. And then the last thing that I think is more important for the Friends of San Damiano, but really I think for this group and the city as a whole, is to make sure that people understand that, I mean, there were a few comments around Friends of San Damiano seems to be stuck at $300,000. So the message clearly is not getting out that, you know, again, we're working on a master plan because that's what we need to know what kind of funds we need to raise and where those funds might be possible. And so I just think that those sort of four threads come to me. There may, other people may have others, but I just think that as we continue through, it's going to be really important for the community to hear that over and over and over again, and get the message out.
Thank you. Anyone else about the building, because otherwise we'll move on to the focus group.
I was just gonna add one more
Sure.
point to Nancy's, or priority, or, you know, her list of 3 or 4 things. I think it's that Indigenous story, and that it's a sacred place and not just a park, for people to think about. That seems to be important in any of the concepts, right, or what have you, so.
Okay.
That's good timing, because the focus group meeting, and I'll let Dan talk a little bit more about it here in a second, but we reached out to the Ho-Chunk and the T-Shop Okora, which is their community center here in Madison, which is actually near McFarland, the highway there. We reached out to Cher. She is the director of the facility, so she gave us some dates this morning. And what we'd like to do is have a workshop with all the focus groups coming together at one time, so that everybody can hear everybody's story. So Dan, if you're available, I'll let you dive into it a little bit more.
Yeah, our hope, or the intent would be to set up kind of an open house with all the focus groups, allowing and kind of promoting that dialogue between the groups, rather than setting up several either separate Zoom calls or meetings, so that the groups can hear and understand the different comments that others have. Looking at doing something like an open house, so we can try to reach the widest range, knowing some of the focus group members are representing their employers and maybe want to come earlier in the day, and others may have to come after. So looking at kind of a long-term, maybe 3 or 4 hour open house, have all of our comments displayed and kind of tracked throughout the evening. As the need is progressed, kind of doing short presentation of the concepts 2 times or so during the day if we get turnover in participants. But looking to get kind of that curated feedback on the concepts, allowing those groups to circle back around to seeing how the feedback they provided in the early stages was addressed. If they have comments on how it can better be applied to the master plan, what makes the most sense, and start to build that out. So that's our hope. Our proposal for that, we'd be looking at probably the 1st of June would be the best date to use the Ho-Chunk facility. Otherwise, they don't have availability till the end of June after that. So we have to probably just look at a different facility at that point. But being able to go to to the Ho Chunk rather than making them come to another meeting. Seem to be the most appropriate way to continue to engage them and the participants that we had at that initial focus group meeting with them at the Tijo.
Questions, anyone?
Are you talking about, I'm sorry, Dan, are you talking about when you say an open house for all of the focus groups, are you talking about the other nonprofit organizations in addition? Are you talking about Friends, the city officials, the Ho Chunk, all the nonprofit groups? Because there were
City officials didn't have one.
Yeah, it was
Park and Rec.
No, that's
the school district or with the schools.
Yeah.
There was like the Friends of Queen Lakes Alliance, that sort of thing. The Friends group.
Ella Leopold.
Ella Leopold, yeah, those folks, those types of focus group meetings we had in phase one.
yeah,
So
and
we're
also be
talking about
the business
basically
owners as
everybody.
well. Yep, it would be all of the groups that we reached out to, and some of those who didn't participate in the initial, but were part of the list would be included for follow-up.
I think that's why it would run 3 or 4 hours, right? Because you see
Yeah.
them coming and going. Is that the
Coming,
idea?
yes.
Yeah, and trying to meet the I know the needs of others as we set up the meetings. Some people had availability all during the day, they can make it kind of work, and they're using it as part of their employment, and others it has to be after hours, evening, more typical public meetings. So trying to make sure that we have that variety to capture as many as possible. And if we don't get great turnout, or if it doesn't turn out to get all the feedback, we certainly could still do another follow-up session. But the hope would be to get everybody there and have more of a kind of charrette or dialogue than just getting individual feedback from meetings and then reporting back as part of a appendix in the report.
Does anyone else have any?
I just,
Andy?
I mean, my gut reaction with the focus groups is, I mean, I don't have Ho Chunk separate and then everybody else, if you want to group them together. I just really want to make sure that we're getting adequate feedback and giving them adequate time and presence to do that. So I don't, maybe it would work fine having everybody together, but I just don't want to, with any organization, particularly Ho Chunk, I don't want to lose them in a crowd, if you will.
That was one piece of the proposal of using their facility is bringing people in. And one thing I think we'd like to kind of turn that dialogue to is having the other focus groups be present with the Ho Chunk. So it's not MSA reporting back on what the Ho Chunk said. These other groups would have the opportunity to hear directly from Bill Quackenbush and Janice Rice and others who are present. And get that direct feedback so they can understand. Most of those groups were very supportive of the concept of Ho Chunk involvement and recognition in the plan and project, whether that be renaming the site or maintaining the gardens or farm and other pieces. So I think there would be good benefit to having all those groups together.
What we learned in the first focus group meeting, and Kyle, if you want to chime in, we learned stories, and that's how Native American communities work, by stories. And Janice told some wonderful stories about her grandparents and how they used the trail going to Milwaukee, came right down, Cottage Grove Road. So those stories are what will help us map out interpretation of the site and how those stories can be told on the site. And when we were speaking as a group, there's a bunch of ideas that were thrown out on the table, like timelines in the landscape or timelines on a board. So it's not hard design like a structure, like a building. It's more of how can this be artful in the land, a part of the landscape or in the landscape. And I think it is beneficial to hear directly, because Dan and I we're hearing and we're not hearing the full story. It's because it's not coming from us. So we're interpreting. And I'd rather, I think it's a good opportunity for the other focus group members that are giving you good ideas for the park and the space to hear the stories and directly, so that we're not interpreting those stories.
Is that something the steering committee would
Yeah, I was just wondering.
intend? That'd be the idea, or?
I think if you could, I think it would be great. You know, unfortunately, if it's on the first, I can't be here. I'm at that Alliance of Historic Landscape Preservation where we interviewed last year from. That's the same time. But Brenda and I have been in a lot of presentations like this with Indigenous communities, and it's the best way to do it because you're hearing directly. And if you can be a part of that, it's amazing. It's amazing to hear this, to hear stories.
We have to say,
He's looking at June 1st right now. There were some days at the end of May, but we didn't think that we could get the members of the focus group turned around quite that fast. So then June 1st and 2nd, Dan's kind of leaning right now.
Mhm. Yeah,
Are you talking like later in the day, Dan, and into the
yeah,
afternoon?
I think we're thinking probably start somewhere between for about 3, go till 7. So you'd have an opportunity if we did a presentation is necessary based on who was there, we'd have one prepared. Do something right away at 3, talk for a while, and then assume we might have another group that kind of comes in and fills up around 5. And then kind of play it by ear though. If it just becomes more of a dialogue and conversation, we'll let that happen and let those attendants kind of hear and be present for that. But certainly be prepared to manage the group as needed to make sure we're getting feedback one way or another.
Is that something you would be facilitating, or you'd have
Yeah, I
a
would-
couple people, or? how
It
does
would
work?
probably have all 3. It would be myself, Emily, and Hannah, who have done or led the initial focus group meetings as well. So those groups would be familiar with us, and then be able to work from there.
Well, I think if you could keep the steering committee apprised of what
The
the
dates.
date you end up setting and what other information we need, I'm sure some of us.
Our plan will be to reach out to the groups tomorrow, and just get some initial feedback. If we get 80% say they can't come, then we'll look at a different date and kind of reevaluate, push it back a little bit. But the hope would be to get this done before the next steering committee meeting to be able to provide feedback to the group on what we've heard.
And that circles us back around to at the beginning of the meeting, somebody, I forget now because it's been a while, asked when will we start working on the master plan?
Right.
So that's the time that we're looking at now. So June, probably first part of June, meet with the focus group. And then start to talk about what elements and what paths to take for the master plan. So that would be more getting closer to July, start
Okay.
digging into that conversation.
Okay, anyone else have any other questions? Nancy, do you have one?
Yeah, I just going back to the focus, the singular focus groups, I'm assuming, Dan, that time frame that you're talking about is a time frame that worked for the focus groups previously, like you did late afternoon, early evenings. I'm just thinking about like the school system, for instance, I don't know, and Jesse's obviously here. But I don't know if, if that late afternoon, early evening, when I think about One City Schools, or when I think about, MG or MG 21 or other nonprofit groups, I don't know if that's the same time frame that we used before with the groups.
Yeah, most of the meetings were kind of in that, I'd say 2 to 6 range when we had those. We had about 5, making a couple individual calls because certain individuals couldn't make the original.
Anybody else? Okay, MSA reports. Did you have anything else to report, Dan? I'm moving down the agenda here.
Yeah, not at this time, because the beer garden was kind of a bust.
Yeah, it's a bummer. The weather is so
Unfortunately.
bad. Jake, did you have anything You have another one coming up at some point. another year.
Yeah, I don't have the date in front of me. It'll be a Friday in June, probably. Not sure, on our website. The only thing operational you'll see up there is we just have a lot of restoration from the tree removals that we had over the winter. So this means some turf restoration happening this summer. We do have Clean Lakes Alliance, is bringing a group of volunteers on Thursday, and that'll actually be Lake Ridge Bank, formerly Monona Bank, employees that will be working on some brush cleanup. So.
It's cool. Nice of them. Andy, did you have anything from the friends?
I don't think I do. Am I missing anything? We're doing a lot. We're still trying to raise business sponsorships with beer gardens. We're working towards a fundraising event in September. But yeah,
I see the next beer garden is the 23rd of June, so. Okay, well, if there's nothing else from anyone on the screen or anything, is there a motion to adjourn?
To adjourn.
Second. All in favor, say aye.
All right.
We are-
Hi.
Thank you all.
Jesse, you had your hand up.
Huh?
Jesse has his hand up.
Oh, Jesse,
I
I'm
was-
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was late to the raising the hand and then I had trouble unmuting. I don't want to hold people up. I guess one thing that I was just going to add that stood out for me from the survey results was, a perceived lack of representation from some subgroups as part of this. So I'm happy to hear that the focus groups are still happening and, just kind of, I know I've heard, this being a park for all. So, just ensuring and maybe thinking about, are we missing anybody? Are we missing any feedback? We have to be intentional from a school standpoint that sometimes just sending out surveys aren't the best way to communicate with all of our families. And I think that for our community as well. So, it just stood out a lot looking at, kind of those subgroups that completed the survey that we might not be, reaching our full representation from our community. And so if we can continue to look at other ways and options to gain the voice of others who might not have as much accessibility to these types of surveys or events.
Good points. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
All right, we are adjourned. See you all in June.
Thank you.